Hey everybody, this is Jason, your host of World History for You. And today we're going to take a look at a very important global product that's circulating in this period from 1200 to 1450, porcelain. All right, now we're going to take a look at two places in particular where we're going to see an impact. All right, first we'll take a look at East Africa, who is receiving some of this porcelain, and then we'll turn to China, who is the producer of this porcelain. Okay, now if you remember last time, we talked about the concept of Southernization, right, from the historian Linda Schaefer. Okay, and in her Southernization thesis, she focused on three regions during this time period, right? She focused on India, the Islamic world, and China as being the kind of core regions in the world system from 1200 to 1450, right? These are the people that are moving the goods and producing the luxury goods, right? You have kind of a surplus of wealth in these areas, okay? And just something to keep in mind is the importance of the Indian Ocean, right? This is kind of the crossroads of global trade during this time period, okay? And one of the more important goods that's circulating is Chinese porcelain, right? These ceramic goods, okay? Now, as I said, one of the places that's receiving this is East Africa, okay? So we'll start with our focus there. Really, really fascinating place, okay? If you're thinking about that in terms of geography today, you're thinking about, southern Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, and even the island of Madagascar, right? So think about that East African coastline, okay? So what's happening there during this period, right? So we're thinking about 1200 to 1450, okay? We have some really interesting changes going on here, okay? You have the arrival of Islam, right? Remember, Schaefer talked about Southernization, right? This idea that you have the influence of Islam in the world, right? Well, we see this in East Africa, okay? Where you have a new syncretic culture developing, right? Syncretic meaning that the blending of cultures, right? To create a new cultural element, okay? So you have Arab Islamic merchants coming to East Africa, intermarrying with some of the indigenous African families, and creating this new blending of African culture with Arab and Islamic culture. Okay? And this will become known as Swahili culture. Okay? And a new language comes out of this that we call Swahili, right? A blending of Arabic and some of these native languages. Okay? Really interesting stuff happening here. Okay? They're not unified politically, so if you look down the coast, you'll see a series of city-states, essentially, right? These are independent, okay? But, again, they have these cultural elements that are tying them together, right? The influence of Islam, which is going to blend with these native cultures to give us the Swahili culture up and down the East African coast, right? Now, these port cities are quite interesting, okay? Like we said, they're independent of one another, right? We call them a city-state, okay? And they become quite prosperous due to this Indian Ocean trade, okay? You end up with this elite class of merchants in places like Kilwa, okay? Due to their connection to the Indian Ocean, right? They're able to bring in goods from the Indian Ocean to Africa and then send goods from Africa out into the Indian Ocean. Okay, and this merchant class becomes quite wealthy, right? They become a new elite class of people in these city-states, okay? And we can see evidence for this, physical evidence, okay? We can see the grand houses that are left behind by these merchants, right? And if you're able to walk through these houses, you can see these niches or creches in the walls where this Chinese porcelain pottery would be displayed, right? You can also see the ruins of the mosques that were built during this time period as well, right? These influence of Islam here. Okay? These are these great stone structures that are still standing today. Okay? And the grand houses are quite amazing. Some of them have bathing pools, etc. Right? So you can really see the elite status that these people are getting from interacting in this network of trade that is happening, right? So again, if we think of a city like Kilwa, one of these city-states on the East African coast, how are they connected to the rest of the world, right? Well, if we look inside of Africa itself, they've got some connections there, right? If you go down south from Kilwa, you have the great civilization of Great Zimbabwe, okay, that they're trading with. Okay? Primarily, what they're bringing out of Great Zimbabwe to send out into the Indian Ocean, few things. You've got, most importantly, gold, but then also the ivory trade is coming out of there as well. Okay, and we have archaeological evidence today that Chinese porcelain is making its way to Great Zimbabwe as well. Okay, we have pottery shards that prove this to us. Okay, now Kilwa also has some connections in the interior sections of Africa where they're bringing goods out. Unfortunately, one of those goods are enslaved people, right, that are getting sent out into the Indian Ocean system. Something we discussed in a previous episode. Right? But there are other things coming out of there too. Things like hardwoods, for example. Okay? Lumber, like teak. Right? And you can see this in a city that Kilwa is connected to. Okay? So if we look at Sharif, Iran, that's where a lot of this lumber ends up that's coming out of the interior of Africa to build grand houses there for the merchant class that is making a lot of money off of this Indian Ocean trade. All right. So what's happening here basically is you have Chinese porcelain making its way to Iran, right, to these port cities, which will then be shipped to a city like Kilwa. Okay. So you have all these international connections happening to make this trade possible. If we turn to China to see where the stuff is coming from, there's some very fascinating stuff happening here, right? We have to think about the scale of the porcelain trade here. They're making enough for their own internal markets, but they're also making enough to sell on a global scale, right? And it's pretty fascinating because if you look at the pottery, the porcelain that's being sold into the Islamic world, it is manufactured specifically for this trade, right? You'll see Islamic elements in the pottery itself, in the designs, right? So it's being marketed, to these regions specifically, right? So they know exactly what they're doing here, right? They have this international focus on the production of porcelain, right? And this is a quite intensive process to produce this porcelain, okay? A lot of steps go into this, right? First, you have to have the clay itself, which is kind of one of those contingencies in history, meaning that it's an accident, right? China just happens to be where this kaolin clay is located, all right? Now, there are other places in the world where you have it too, but they're the first to really take advantage of this, right? And to develop it into a global product, right? Now, how do you do this, right? After you get the clay, you have to work the clay, right? Which is kind of a proto-industrial process of its own, right? You have water wheels spinning to smash the clay, to work the clay, all right? Now, you also need potters, right? Once you get the clay worked to the right consistency, you've got to turn that into pieces, right? So you have to have this artisan class who is skilled and trained in what they're doing, right? You have to have a whole nother set of people who are painting the designs on them, right? The glaze, right? You have to have people managing wood lots to fire the kilns, right? To produce all of this, okay? Once it's produced, the next step is getting it out to the world, right? So you have to have the infrastructure in place to do that as well, right? So you need canals, right? You need roads, you need ships, etc., to make sure that this can reach the international market, right? And that's one of the places where the government steps in. Government's going to be responsible for a lot of this infrastructure, building of canals, roads, etc. But they're also going to be responsible for the management of some of these porcelain manufacturing centers, right? They want to ensure that this is being done right, right? So you see heavy government involvement in this too, okay? Now, when we think about China and their international relations, there's kind of a mixed history there, right? Some emperors preferred to focus more on China's internal issues, right? Focus on things like agriculture, northern borders, those kind of things. While at other times you have emperors who are more focused on international relations and international trade, right? And this leads to one of the more interesting episodes in this period in world history, all right? We get the voyages of Zheng He here, okay? So he's a admiral that's going to lead an expedition, actually 7 expeditions out into the Indian Ocean. All right, so around 1400, during the Ming Dynasty, we get a new emperor. And he's one of these guys that's more focused on international trade, right, and international diplomacy. Okay? And there's some reasons for that. One, previous administrations had kind of wrecked the economy, okay, to the point where they're issuing paper money, too much of it, in fact, which is creating inflation and all kinds of problems in the economy. So they end up settling on silver as their currency. And unfortunately, there's just not a lot of it in China. So where are you going to get it, right? You've got to seek it from outside Chinese borders, right? So that's where international trade comes in, right? That's a way to bring in silver so you can have more currency in circulation, and so you can also collect taxes in this silver currency, right? And that's where someone like Zheng He comes in. Okay, so this new emperor goes on a shipbuilding frenzy. They build about 1,600 ships. Okay? That's a lot of ships. Not only do you have to build the ships, but you have to have the infrastructure for these boats too, right? You have to have ports and docks, etc. And there's a noticeable deforestation because of this, right? There's an actual environmental impact to this frenzy of shipbuilding under this new emperor. Okay? Now, out of these 1,600 ships, they're going to take 300 of them, put them under the leadership of Admiral Zheng He, and send him out into the Indian Ocean for a couple of reasons. One, you want to establish diplomatic ties. Two, you want to establish good trade relations. Okay? And three, like we said, you want to bring in that silver. Okay? Now, if we focus on diplomacy, for example, there's a really fascinating tablet that the Chinese bring to Sri Lanka. Okay? It's written in 3 languages. It addresses 3 to 4 different religions. It basically says, we are coming here to establish peaceful trade with you, right? That's what we want out of this. And they're asking for blessings from the gods for this to happen, okay? Now, that's not to say that there's not conflicts out of any of these 7 voyages. There is. Usually what we see here is China getting involved in a local conflict, okay? And what they want out of this is an outcome that's favorable to China, okay? But that's pretty rare, right? For the most part, they're going around speaking with local diplomats and establishing relationships. In fact, they bring ambassadors back from East Africa, from the Middle East, from India to China, okay? Now, it's interesting to compare this to what's going to happen when Europe rounds Africa and makes it to the Indian Ocean, right? So we see the Chinese very powerful. I mean, they're sending out a flotilla of 300 ships here, right? They could have done some damage, but they don't, right? Europe's going to take a different tack, right? When they make it around Africa and into the Indian Ocean, they want to control the system, right? Which is kind of the opposite of what China's trying to do. China's trying to influence it, but they're not necessarily trying to control it. So, for example, the Portuguese, they want full control, okay? At one point, they'll end up bombing Calcutta in India. They'll track down ships on the ocean to try to determine who's allowed to traverse these shipping lanes. In fact, they try to make a permit system saying you have to get permission from the Portuguese to sail anywhere in the Indian Ocean, right? And this will be followed by the Dutch, the British, the French, who are all going to have their own variations on this armed trading and control of the Indian Ocean, okay? So with that said, it's still going to take a long time for them to get total control, right? It's really not until the Industrial Revolution, when we get steamships, that they're going to be able to have a firm grip on what's actually happening in the Indian Ocean, right? You're able to chase down these ships that are powered by sail and wind once you have your fossil fuel powered ships, right? So it takes hundreds of years for them to get to this point, right? Now, the last thing I do want to bring up here is in this discussion of porcelain, right? We want to kind of foreshadow what's going to happen here. So like I said, this is going to be a very important global good, not just in this period, but moving forward as well, okay? Just like the East Africans, just like the people of the Middle East desire these Chinese porcelain goods, Europeans are going to want these things as well, okay? So the British in particular, right? There's 2 things they're going to want from China. 1, tea. 2, the porcelain to drink that tea out of, okay? In fact, they're going to buy so much tea and porcelain from China that they're going to end up in a trade deficit, okay? Meaning they've got an outflow of wealth going to China with nothing coming back to England, right? The Chinese aren't buying anything from the British. The British aren't producing anything that China wants, okay? So they come up with a plan for this, and it's a pretty wild plan, which is essentially we're going to become an international drug dealing empire, okay? So they're going to take what's their colonization of India, turn India basically into a growing and production center for opium so they can sell the stuff to China to ease their trade deficit, right? So basically what we're looking at is they want to get the Chinese hooked on opium, all right, to erase this trade deficit. Now, obviously, China's not going to be very happy with this, right? They're going to do what they can to stop it. However, the British are dead set on this, and you end up with 2 wars over this, 2 opium wars, okay, which will severely wound China's ability to fend off future colonialism, right? This is really having a pretty large impact on Chinese sovereignty, right? And this will be kind of the beginning of what in China today they refer to as a century of humiliation, this period when Europeans begin to eat away at the sovereignty of China here, okay? Now, that's coming in the future, right? This desirability of European porcelain, okay? So again, this is something we're going to come back to, right? Are these very specific global goods that are going to have these global historical impacts, okay? Now, future episodes, we'll look at some more global goods. We'll look at cotton, for example, right, coming out of India, okay? And how that's going to have an impact, not just on this time period, but on future time periods as well, okay? So, future episodes, like I said, we'll take a look at Indian cotton. We'll take a look at the Islamic role in the world system. We'll look at what's going on in Southeast Asia, and we'll look at Europe as well, okay? All right, so thanks for joining us today. Please make sure you subscribe and share, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody. Hey, you. Thanks for watching World History for You. Please subscribe and share with your friends. We'll see you next time.